This is Jeremy Bluma. I am the project manager for the West-Wide Energy Corridor Reviews. I'm joined today by our project team from Argonne National Lab, as well as Reggie Woodruff from the Forest Service. And I want to thank folks who were able to participate in the regional review workshops for Regions 4, 5, and 6. As we show here, we kind of covered some ground here, had 4 meetings across 4 different states. And we promised that we would do sort of a follow-up and report out on some of the findings and the discussions that were had at these workshops so that we could involve anyone who wasn't able to personally participate at the workshops, and as well as just kind of fill in folks who were participating at one workshop, maybe weren't involved with all 4. So that's the point of today's webinar, and we wanted to start off by thanking folks for taking the time to participate in these workshops and for your participation today as well. We hope to keep this to about a half hour. Want to cover some ground here and save some time at the end for questions and comments. So we'll just kind of dive right in here. Heidi, if you could advance us one slide. To remind everybody again, if you didn't participate, the purpose of these workshops that we had over the last few weeks was to provide generally some transparency about the process that we're going through with the West-Wide Energy Corridor Review, to kind of present what challenges that we face as an agency and as stakeholders to citing preferable or more favorable pathways across these western landscapes for energy transmission projects, as well as to involve folks in those types of brainstorming activities and ideas where we can look to improve these energy pathways. So a couple of examples that we have listed here of the challenges were like facilitating, maximizing utility across the landscapes for future infrastructure, as well as minimizing environmental adverse impacts. These are the challenges that are faced by the BLM and the Forest Service every day of the week, and we try to do a good job of orderly administration across those lands. And for interstate transportation purposes, we're trying to find pathways that will lend themselves to both maximizing favorable pathways so we can reduce permitting times, as well as reducing impacts to the most important and valuable resources of those landscapes that we also cherish and love. So another standard and hurdle that we're trying to get over too is to identify where new energy generation may be needed and may be on the horizon. Whether that's wind or solar or geothermal, new hydro storage or anything like that. We're trying to take all that stuff into consideration as we look for where are these pathways relevant and needed. So it was a good forum. It was a robust discussion that we had. We had a lot of varied and diverse interests throughout these workshops, and just really came out with some really good input from that we're still digesting now. I want to pass it over to Ellen to kind of cover the next 2 slides. If Heidi, if you'd advance one more slide. And
hi, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
This is Ellen White with Argonne National Laboratory. I'm just going to walk through briefly the agenda that the workshop, or the format that the workshops went through. They were from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., so pretty much all day. And each workshop began with welcome and introduction and orientation. Everyone introduced each other themselves. And then we broke out into a breakout session in the morning. We had 2 separate groups discussing 1 corridor each. So one group would discuss quarter 1, and the second group would discuss quarter 2, and then for about 45 minutes, and then we would get together and report out and discuss with each group had talked about and any consensus or issues that were brought up. And then in the afternoon, the same thing, a second breakout session. We divided into two groups. One group discussed quarter number 3, and another group discussed quarter number 4. And we also had a second report out session, and then concluded, talked about next steps before adjourning at 3 p.m. So just to give an overview of how the format went with these workshops, and to give you an idea that we really did go in depth and have a discussion amongst all participants about these corridors. Next slide. So we don't have a full list here of everyone that attended. It wouldn't fit very easily on the slide because we had a lot of participation. But we had representation from federal government agencies, Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, National Park Service, tribal representatives, state and local government agencies. State agencies included departments of transportation and wildlife agencies. We had a lot of input and participation from local governments and counties, industry representatives, as well as non-governmental organizations. And like I said, the complete list of organizations are not on this PowerPoint webinar, but we will include all the list of every participating organization in a summary of the workshops document that will be posted to the website in the next couple of weeks. And Jeremy will get to that later, but you will be able to see the list of everyone that participated in the workshop.
Appreciate that, Ellen. Thank you, Heidi, for advancing here. With those breakout sessions, wanted to just, and we're just trying to kind of lay the groundwork here today of what happened at the workshops for folks who couldn't be there. But the particular information that we were looking for and seeking through the breakout sessions was, where can the agencies look to realign some of these energy corridors or improve them? We looked along existing infrastructure and looked at the trade-offs of following certain pathways as opposed to where these corridors currently exist. We looked at a lot of different potential future different development. We heard a lot of varying perspectives from different interest groups as well as local landowners and county personnel, county commission staff, and so on, with sort of really speaking about the different concerns and issues that energy corridors bring with them. And so it was a pretty robust conversation, and we learned a lot with regard to these different concerns and issues and potential areas where we believe that these energy corridors can be improved. So we look forward to developing that into our report, which will be coming out later this year. And at this point, we're just trying to kind of give a synopsis of what we kind of gathered through that process and where we're at today. Other things was looking at also revising or developing new interagency operating procedures. Those are things that we can maybe approach how things are done within these energy corridors or for projects that are proposed across agencies as more of a standard and baseline, so that everyone is following the same sort of the rules and standards for what needs to be done, what needs to happen for certain issues, whether that's wildlife corridors, if that's cultural resources, if there's certain issues that can be more programmatically looked at. We're looking at ways that we can build consistency among agencies so that there's predictability from both industry as well as other special interests out there, whether that's natural resources issues and interests, or if it's private land type concerns and things of that nature. So we're looking at all those things and trying to kind of develop some more standard practices and best management practices that could aid and help with the process and find ourselves in a better end situation. Next slide, Heidi. So as we addressed, looking at the corridors and looking for ways to improve them, we had to, of course, do that through the lens of our settlement agreement, which talked about looking at ways to potentially revise, delete, or add new corridors. And so with that, a lot of this, it all comes down to corridor revisions. It's whether we delete or add or adjust. We're trying to revise this network to find ways where it's going to be relevant and work better for the big picture. So not just for industry and not just for resource standpoint, but that it's going to work good for today as well as into the future. And so the corridors, there's numerous environmental concerns, of course, and so the big thing is, of course, with any sort of corridor, you end up with pinch points, resource conflicts, or just gaps between, federal land. So if we have commingled or interspersed federal land, it becomes problematic. And so we're trying to reach out amongst a robust cross-section of stakeholders so that we can kind of better understand the issues of how do we address certain issues, whether that's crossing private lands or what do we do, how are the considerations that need to be taken into effect handled by the agency when we have a corridor across federal land, but then we have interspersed gaps of that energy corridor. Same thing with tribal lands and state lands. How can we better coordinate amongst all these different land management entities? So the agencies, we also received a bunch of stakeholder input about corridor recommending different revisions, deletions, or additions. This was another forum to look at that and to hear some more input about what we've already gathered through writing. So next slide, please. And Ellen, if you want to walk through this table at all, go right ahead.
Sure. I'm not going to go through each one of these corridors, but this is just a list of each workshop, which corridors we reviewed. You'll notice there's more than 4 corridors for, I think, each one of these. And that's usually because a corridor was adjacent or near another corridor, and they were kind of discussed together. The potential revision or the issues were discussed together. And so in a number of these cases, we ended up talking about more than just the 4 corridors. But the list is here. And again, I'm not going to go through each one. There's not enough time today. But next slide.
And Reggie, I was hoping that you would be able to, talk us through these next couple slides if you're on and have hit *6 so that we can hear you.
I am on. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. So actually, I can't see the slides progressing, but I'm following along. So for my narrative here over the next 2 to 3 slides, Heidi, could you jump to slide number 10? And again, I can't see, so I'm going to assume that we're looking at slide 10. So as Jeremy and Ellen stated, we had a...
Reggie, could you just tell me, I'm not sure of the slide numbers, what's the text at the top of the slide?
It's examples of potential corridor additions.
All right, I'm on that. Thank you.
Okay, all right. So as Jeremy and Ellen stated, we had a diverse group of stakeholders, and we found that very good, refreshing, informative, that folks are interested in this whole engagement, and that we can have a group of folks who are representing various opinions about the corridors, expressing and communicating the issues that are most important to them. As Jeremy also stated, these corridors impact different stakeholders, different lands, and so getting that diverse group of folks together to express what's most important to them was very informative. And we just have to keep in mind that the outcome of the project is providing our decision makers suggestions on how to best utilize these corridors. So we're trying to provide recommendations, suggestions on additions, deletions, and revisions. So I'm starting with additions here because I see this as being the most difficult to do. Based on just the difficulty of land resource management on Forest Service and BLM land, all the things that are considered in that whole process, actually designating new corridors is probably the most difficult thing to do. And there's just a proliferation of things, environmental issues, just need for that site-specific analysis and scoping when you are going through a process of identifying where to site things. So adding corridors is difficult, but we have heard you, and these are some of the key rationale for adding corridors. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these when we get to the slide on revision. So let's go back a slide to slide number 9, which is talking about deletion. And again, I can't see, I'll assume we're there. So, deleting corridors, it would be kind of less difficult for the agency. However, it's contrary to the intent of designating corridors in the first place. So we want to avoid as much as possible deleting corridors unless we're adding corridors to replace them, so that we can have or provide opportunities for companies, land managers to work together in doing some siting in the most ideal locations. So key things when we're talking about deleting is we want to avoid as much as possible, wildlife habitats, wilderness areas. There's difficulties in siting in roadless areas, so not totally impossible there. But we want to minimize impacts as much as possible, provide the most ideal route. And we've been giving, we've summarized these from the slide as key issues when providing recommendations or suggestions for deleting corridors. And back one more slide to revisions. And I'm going to assume we're there. So revising the corridors, that's the kind of the sweet spot, I would say, as far as this whole effort. And we've heard, this is the most popular slide here because we had many recommendations, heard many concerns about, why corridors should be revised. Some key things we heard were corridors leading from federal lands, BLM Forest Service lands, into private or tribal lands. And we wanted to reiterate that we are only responsible for how we manage, the corridor positions on the federal lands. However, we are taking note that some tribes and private landowners are concerned about potential development that leads into their lands. On the flip side of that, there were private landowners and tribes who would encourage development across their lands for various reasons, rent, providing additional electricity to some of these lands in the case of that's a key concern. Another was pointed out that we're underutilizing existing infrastructure rights of way. So there's been, since this corridor settlement was reached, since the records of decision designating the corridor were reached, there have been several projects that have been developed on the lands that partially use the corridors and some that didn't use them at all. So the recommendation is that we utilize these new infrastructures that have come online to help to designate corridors. And I think that's an excellent idea and something that we'll certainly consider and certainly put forth to our decision makers. Another key issue was the impact to the national trails and waterways. So what we learned is that whereas it's not ideal if a corridor follows the length of a trail or the length of a waterway, it could be feasible to have one or two crossings so that you are reducing the visual impacts, reducing the impacts to waterways and trails. So that's certainly something we'll look at as far as providing recommendations to our decision makers when we're looking at revising corridors. One last thing is that an issue as far as the acquired lands. Again, since this whole initiative came about, there have been lands that the agencies have acquired, and so we should look at what's the feasibility of designating corridors across these acquired lands. Certainly, there are certain limitations based on if the lands were required for conservation easements or what have you. But certainly that's something that we should take into consideration that time has passed. There are new things that have gone on as far as purchasing land, as far as new energy development. So we want to take those things into consideration. And one final thing, we had a diverse group of folks in the room. We didn't have as much input from utilities. And a key issue, a key concern with the settlement and as we move forward is identifying those new areas of generation, new areas for renewable generation, new areas where there's natural gas leasing going on, so that we can see where potentially the transmission lines and the pipelines will be running from, so that we can align corridors, if possible, with those future areas of development. So these are the things we've here kind of summarized from the feedback we got, and as we work on our reports that we will provide to leadership, we'll be working from these recommendations here.
Appreciate that, Reggie. That's a lot that we're looking at, of course, with regard to revisions, and I think that it was well stated to say that, yeah, the addition of new corridors is probably the hardest thing. The deletions, obviously, less hard, but need to be well justified, and, of course, revisions, we feel like the most info we got was from those. Ellen, if you wouldn't mind, go through slide 11 here.
Sure. So we're moving on to general themes that we, from feedback that we heard at the workshop. And a lot of these were for maybe specific corridors, but they could be applied generally across any of the corridors. And so we want to take a look at that and receive the feedback sort of in a general way to see how we could apply them, all the corridors. And one that you've already heard both Jeremy and Reggie speak to so far is issues with private or state land or tribal land, and improved engagement needed with those other land holders, other local government, private land owned locally by the state or tribal land. And from local government, improved engagement could include considering the corridor revisions during the land use planning stage. So after this stage, where we provide recommendations, and that's actually considered at the land use planning stage. And then also at the project-specific level when project proponents approach the agencies with an application of routes to reach out and engage with those local governments where a project might cross into private land. Improved coordination with state agencies. We heard this from departments of transportation, especially when considering crossing or co-locating energy corridors within highway rights-of-way. But this could also be for coordination with wildlife agencies as well. And lastly, improving coordination with tribes to improve energy corridor placement through or in the vicinity of tribal lands. And like Reggie said, either to avoid tribal lands where that's preferred, or perhaps having the corridor go right up to tribal lands if they would prefer having the corridor go through their lands for a number of reasons. So just improved coordination and engagement with tribes as well.
Appreciate that, Ellen. Next slide, please, Heidi. And as we're going through this, I want folks to understand that everything that we're going through is sort of what is being fed into and is going to be part of the review and the report that we are preparing, which, as Reggie put, we're trying to develop and synthesize all of what we have gathered from you and from all the other stakeholders who've been engaged. We are taking all that information and trying to develop what we've said we would be doing at those meetings is developing ideas that can be carried into the land use planning at each agency, so that that these things are front and center from a macro standpoint, macro scale, so that we're trying to bring that big picture view to the local, individual land use planning divisions, based on forest, based on field office, based on the smaller unit. And so some of those themes that we're seeing over and over here is, that obviously corridors need to avoid sensitive resources to the extent possible. And of course, we are looking to always avoid the highest value first, and then to, go gradually down the scale as far as we can to minimize impacts entirely. And with that, obviously communicating with project proponents up front that wider corridors sometimes provide that flexibility, and trying to educate folks that just because we have a wide corridor doesn't mean that we necessarily plan to fill it all up. You may have a 2-mile wide corridor, but part of the reason for some of that may be just to enable a project to get within those wide sideboards a general pathway, and then they can microsite through that after their as their analysis goes on for a project specific proposal. They have the latitude to be able to zigzag around as necessary to avoid the highest value resources within that sort of overall pathway that goes between points A and points B. So another point here is also some themes that we kept on hearing is to site corridors on public land as much as possible. That would be both to reduce impacts to local economics, local communities, and individual landowners, of course. And so that's a theme that has just come up repeatedly. And we are hearing that loud and clear, and we're looking at and trying to develop ways to where we can do exactly that. Consider ideas to where we can move these corridors more so on federal land and still maintain the least amount of impact and the most viable pathway available. We're also considering whether corridor revisions could result in more of a spider web of infrastructure, and how, if proponents use both the old corridor and new corridor locations, we're trying to reduce or eliminate the proliferation of just that spider webbing across the landscape, so that we can maintain those large blocks of public land and forest land, so that they're able to be enjoyed by today and future generations. Of course, a general theme that comes up is we do get proposals for corridor deletions if it's not a preferable location, and an alternative location in demand is not really well documented. To just identify if there's really a preference or if there's not a preference. If there's truly not a preference, it may make more sense to kind of open it up and advertise a singular pathway as a guaranteed, like that's going to be the best place possible. We want to be more clear in our plans, as I spoke at the meeting and reiterate again here. Another thing is we've tried to explain how potential corridor revisions could impact valid existing right and mining operations and things of that nature. That has come up a few times now, and certainly that there's some interest in any sort of existing rights, valid existing rights, whether it's mining or otherwise, and we expect to be able to clarify that a bit more in the report that we'll have out here later this year. Lastly, co-locating the infrastructure. To the extent possible, analyze the potential additional costs or separation, integrity requirements, and corridor width concerns. These are things that we keep on hearing, and we plan to address these things in the report, of course, and to find ways to where we might address concerns at the first transmission line or pipeline that would come into a corridor isn't just cherry picking the best spots through that corridor, but that we have a plan for a little bit more orderly administration of those corridors so that we can maintain separation from any sort of incompatible things such as electrical lines and pipelines with induction and just the costs that come up with that, so that we can manage that in a way that's going to work for the bigger picture of making sure that it's a viable pathway for both types of utilities, if that's what our plan is. Next slide. Ellen, you were going to take this energy demand slide?
Sure. Another concept we heard, general theme, was energy demand, where energy is coming from and where it needs to go needs to be considered when siting corridors. In particular, to evaluate recently authorized projects and why or why not they're located within the Section 368 energy corridors, and if not, what does that mean? Why, was it due to energy demand or maybe some other reason? Evaluate energy demand in terms of regions 4, 5, and 6. We discussed recent proposals to bring energy from Wyoming through Idaho to Nevada, as well as interest in pipeline development in Oregon. Question that a number of people brought up, especially in Oregon, was whether corridors should be for domestic energy transportation rather than pathways for corridor export to non-U.S. destinations. Also was brought up that the corridor designations and the routes need to be data-driven and with specific data about energy, where it's going, where it's coming from, and future energy needs, and as well as connectivity to renewable energy development. Where is renewable energy being developed? Are there renewable energy zones that can be connected to some of these energy corridors to help provide transmission to where renewable energy might be developed? And then lastly, someone questioned whether or not there's a need for large planning corridors right now, and if distributed energy generation will sort of decrease the need for these large corridors.
Thank you, Ellen. I just want to talk just for a second about the regional review process and sort of looking forward planning, and we'll get to next steps here in just a second as well. So, of course, with the settlement agreement that we are looking through the lens of for how we are reviewing these energy corridors, it really has always come down to 4 siting principles about maximizing utility, minimizing impact, and trying to be efficient with the use of the landscapes, focus on areas where we can connect into and support renewable energy development, and with that, we're trying to come up with a abbreviated or summarized list and synopsis of the macro scale that we've heard from everyone regarding what can be done to improve the energy corridor and the energy corridor network across the 11 western states. But how does this all feed into the agency's process? The review itself will be completed at the end of the calendar year, and we want to encourage our staff and our agencies and our leaders to take these findings and consider them in their land use planning. That is where they will have to look at it a bit closer than we were able to at this macro scale review. And we hope that those will be considered and run to ground in a way that they come up with even better ideas and solutions than we have, but maintaining that integrity of an energy and interstate network of pathways for energy transmission. We believe that that's going to feed into predictability for industry as well as environmental groups, understanding that we are trying to balance out and reduce impacts from a cumulative standpoint, and that this will help with our NEPA tiering for project level reviews, and which can get us through that process to find a pathway, or to just know that a pathway is bad and we need to reject that, and try to steer things more towards where we do feel like it's more preferable and more palatable from a overall standpoint. How is that going to be done? Well, we're looking at passing this to the agencies for them to consider in their normal course of business as they go through land use planning, or if they do a land use plan amendment to serve just the corridor purposes. They can certainly look at this at any time. There's some ideas about doing a statewide or even a multi-state things. That has not been set in stone, although some states have shown some initiative with looking at trying to do that in an efficient manner, just do it as a statewide effort. So what we come up with through all this is going to be fed into that, so that as they look at their statewide or their regional-wide piece of the puzzle, that they'll be able to have the bigger picture available to them. We hope that that will address some implementation of the different things that we'll have to address. Compensatory mitigation was something that was addressed or spoke to in the original Westwood Energy Corridor PEIS, and that may be something that will be looked at or considered. Certainly, CEQ regulations will dictate, the hierarchy. And through this process, we hope that this is laying the groundwork for some improved data sharing capabilities across the BLM, the Forest Service, working with state agencies, local governments, tribal governments, and that we can develop this process in a way that it lays the groundwork for that similar process to be continued and stepped down at the local level. And of course, it's all about trade-offs. It's all about trying to find ways to address competing concerns or issues, and even from the agency standpoint, to address certain things in our land use plans where we have competing priorities. Next slide, please. So the next step is, of course, we're processing through everything, and we're going to develop a report that will have potential revisions, deletions, or additions within this Region 456 area. So across these states, we'll be developing that, and we'll be pushing that out, as we had recently with the Region 1 report, for feedback on those potential revisions, deletions, or additions to the energy corridor network. And so we anticipate that's going to be this fall of 2019, and that we'll be pushing that out for your input and just general stakeholder input. And we anticipate finalizing the entire energy corridor review this calendar year and having a compilation of a combined report so that it's just one clearinghouse document that can be utilized by the agencies and referenced in any subsequent land use planning and environmental reviews. Next slide. And I apologize that we went a little bit longer than I had anticipated, but I want to open it up if there's any specific questions. Folks, you would have to hit *6 to be able to speak, or you can type it in the chat. That is, we kind of want to do an outbrief here following those meetings, and this slide shows sort of the 11 western states that we're looking at and where the corridors currently exist. We hope to be able to deliver some ideas that you have helped produce with our report that will be coming out this fall. Be a little type in the chat box. Sounds like we might have a question or two, perhaps. I see your question here, Bruce. Where can we find the settlement agreement? We will send an email out, making sure that everyone can has the link to the project website for the energy corridor reviews. Within that website, there's a documents page, and it is a clearinghouse of since the Energy Policy Act was signed in 2005, and the programmatic EIS was put into place, and the following lawsuit settlement agreement, we will get that out to this entire group of folks who have registered for this webinar, and make that you should be able to just click on that and go to it. So I hope that that helps. And Laura has provided in the chat box right here as well. The slide presentation, yes, it will be made available, and we also will have sort of a more formal write-up summary as well, in addition to the slideshow. So yes, that'll be available as well. And there will be a recording of this webinar posted for anyone who was not able to attend on this exact date and time. That will be available on the website, and it will be there will be a notification put out when that is posted as well. Jim's question, BLM has a number of land use plan activities underway now. Are corridors being considered in the process? It's a good question, Jim, and we have been aware of that as well. To the extent possible, as we kind of go through the review, certainly there's concurrent efforts always going on with different offices and stuff. So we have tried to coordinate as much as we can with certain offices who are moving along sort of in tandem with our effort, and yet be able to necessarily catch every one of those things. Some are too far along for us to kind of throw in everything we've just learned. So, for example, I mean, there might be a land use plan that's almost down the home stretch and in Idaho, to where we may not be able to have these findings in our sort of potential revisions, deletions, or additions to those corridors in that area before they get completed with that. But certainly, once we're completed with the review, which is one of the emphases of doing the review, is to enable the agencies to make those revisions and changes to the corridors as appropriate, because due to the settlement agreement, the agencies have deferred to kind of just keep on carrying forward the existing corridors as they were designated in 2009, since we really didn't have the clarity of the review complete to be able to do that. So in those cases, we're trying to coordinate to the extent that we can, where we have where those things lend themselves to it. But otherwise, we'll have to take it up again after the review is complete. Any last questions? Do a couple more things being typed. Will the group be notified when the 30-day comment period for this report begins as follows? Yes. Everyone who has signed up for this webinar, as well as registered on the website or attended the meetings, we have your email address and contact information, and we intend to send an email blast out to everyone to notifying them that report would be available for that 30-day comment period. Yeah. Well, if there's no other questions, I will say thank you very much for your participation today, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your week.
Jeremy, oh, sorry. People were still typing, so never mind. Thank you.
Thanks, Connie. Appreciate that. All right, everybody. I appreciate it. Hope you all have a great weekend and 4th of July week next week, and we will be in touch as things progress. Take care.